A reading from Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to them, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hard-heartedness, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. You should follow the law and live a law-abiding lifestyle the vast majority of the time. I don't intend to build towards some Thomas Jefferson-esque argument that we should only follow just laws and break unjust ones. That may indeed be necessary in the course of human events, but I want to talk about breaking perfectly just, reasonable, and important laws that exist to protect people's life, liberty, and property. You cannot legally trespass onto another person's property. U.S. law takes such a strong stance against trespassing that the Castle Doctrine allows you to shoot trespassers in some states under some circumstances. Now, let's imagine that on the other side of a high fence, with a posted "No Trespassing" sign, lays a wounded person bleeding and shouting for help. The ban on trespassing presents no inherent injustice, yet morally you should render aid, and in doing so, break the law. Probably, the odds are, that no cop or district attorney would prosecute you for this crime because you did it to save a life. Also, the property owner who you committed the trespass against would not charge you in this specific instance. Still, you broke the law. Now imagine that you can't get an ambulance to carry the bleeding person to the hospital. Instead, you load them into your car. The wounds pose a mortal danger to the person. You don't have much time. Speed limits exist to keep people safe. 2,000-pound objects, particularly ones going faster than the other 2,000-pound objects around them, present real risks. Still, to save a life, you speed. You break the law. A similar logic pervades Christ's actions in Mark 2 and 3. Humans adore absolutes. Is it black or is it white? We approach law, human and divine, with this same absolutist approach. But Jesus didn't. God's law is laid out in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and as interpreted through the Talmud over the millennia, gives concreteness to our calls to love God and love neighbor. You can show your love to God by keeping the Sabbath, by approaching God in specific, reverent ways, and by keeping yourself clean and healthy. You can show love to your neighbor by not killing them, by not robbing them, and by providing for them in times of need. Any teacher, parent, or policymaker will tell you that humans need specific instructions. And the law gives us something that we need by turning the principles of loving God and loving neighbor into explicit and theoretically followable instructions. And the vast majority of the time, this works great. You keep the Sabbath, you don't kill, you provide for those in need, you uphold the law. At issue here is, what do you do when they bash into each other? When a call to care and provide means going against one of the primary ways to show love to God. In contravening the Sabbath rules, Jesus breaks a big one. Keeping the Sabbath remains one of the major ways that Jewish people live out their love of God. They keep God's day as a day for study, worship, family, and rest, giving their every week a holy rhythm. I live in a historically Jewish neighborhood, and on my way back from the bakery on a Saturday morning or early afternoon, I see the conservative and Orthodox Jewish communities walking their way back home after services. Operating a machine, such as a car, constitutes work. So even in the Houston heat, where a moment outdoors would melt the will of anyone, they go on foot. In the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, they program the elevators to automatically stop on every floor during the Sabbath because pushing a button to activate a machine constitutes work. This may sound absurdly detail-oriented to the Protestant Christian ear, but actually, this all demonstrates a form of worship so profound as to upend your way of living every week, connecting you to God, to your faith community, and to the hundreds of generations of Sabbath-following Jews that came before you. Jesus breaks the Sabbath law to feed his traveling band and to heal a man. He reminds his rule-obsessed interlocutors that law-breaking for the sake of others has historical precedence, as he brings up in Mark chapter 2, verses 25 and 26. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions." In that story, David, fleeing Saul, seeks the assistance of a priest, and the priest gives him the only bread available, the holy bread dedicated to God. When presented with the question of feed a man on the run and unjustly persecuted, or maintain absolute holiness, the priest chose to help. Jesus gives an additionally punchy retort in verse 27. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath." We have the Sabbath, and the other holiness rules, as tools to help us connect with God. They exist for us. We exist to connect to God, not simply to follow rules. If the rules get in the way of our ability to connect with God by helping another or promoting our basic survival, the rules, even profoundly important ones like the Sabbath, go out the window. This is how the 20th century theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer ended up involved in the Valkyrie plot to kill Hitler. Bonhoeffer writes about this decision in his unfinished opus, Ethics. The Decalogue orders us not to kill. Not murdering your neighbor certainly demonstrates your love for them. However, what do you do when that person is Hitler? He ran a regime that, at his orders, created an industrial murder machine, the death camps, which weren't really camps, but factories to churn out death as effectively and cost-efficiently as possible. Hitler had such an absolute hold on power that your only hope of ending the industrial-scale killing of the innocent was to kill Hitler. To love others, to stop their senseless killing, Bonhoeffer sought to break the law against taking a life. When faced with the conflict between arbitrarily following a law and showing love, Christ, the incarnation of the Word of God, chose love. It lands us in more of a gray space than we like. We have to actually discern right and wrong, loving and unloving, what might matter most to God in any particular moment. We love a simple set of rules, but the complexities of the real world don't often afford us those options. Instead, a life of faith means navigating uncertainty with God as our North Star. We will get it wrong sometimes, and for that, we have God's grace. God might lead you to break the law, though, and it might just save somebody.